In today's Lightroom video, I'm going to share an amazing black and white editing technique by initially starting out with a very low contrast and a very flat picture, and then adding a lot of local contrast and clarity and blacks to really get the most amount of dynamic and interest in the picture as possible. So I'm going to take this raw file right here, which is from Edinburgh. I shot it a few years back, and it's not the most amazing raw file, but I do think that with the right editing, it could really work very well. So in this black and white technique, there are 5 basic steps, and step 1 is to turn the picture into black and white and make it very low contrast and very flat. So I'm going to do that by raising the shadows, bringing down the highlights, bringing the contrast into the minus, bringing up the blacks, and even bring the clarity a little bit to the minus. So now you can see it's very flat, very washed out, but that is exactly the look that we want in order to add all of that local contrast and clarity. Then step 2 is just adding local contrast, clarity and blacks, and there are pretty much 3 tools that you want to use for that. One is the graduated filter, then the radial filters, and lastly the adjustment brushes. And what I'm gonna do first is just go into the graduated filters, and once again just add contrast, decrease the blacks, and add a little bit of clarity, and then I'm just gonna drag it over one side of the picture with a very soft edge. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I already get a lot of differentiation from one side to the other side of the picture. And here it's very important that you don't want to make it look too much, you don't want to go for anything like that. You really want to just kind of set the starting base for all of these local adjustments. So I do think that actually works really well, and also just go with your whole scheme of the picture. For example, I really like the foreground being very crisp and a lot of clarity, maybe a little bit darker, and then the background being almost a little bit washed out even at the end. But after you've added your graduated filters, in this case I really only think I need one. I'm gonna go into the radial filters and just add contrast, minus blacks and clarity there. And you want to make sure that your feather is at 100 and that you invert the mask. And you want to use these radial filters to just add local contrast, clarity and all of that stuff on a very kind of broad area. So for example, I think I'm gonna add a little bit on this house right here. I'm gonna drag another one over there, maybe just adjust the blacks a little bit. And the great thing about these radial filters is that you can just right click and duplicate and then drag it over another spot. For example, maybe this car line right here, really just with a little bit. And once again, this is really for the bigger adjustments. Afterwards, we're gonna go into the adjustment brushes and really go over the very fine structures and also zoom in. So this is just kind of for your general look and general feel of the picture. So maybe another one, let's see here, maybe just a smaller one over the top here. And once again, you always want to adjust these settings with each filter so you have the best possible look at the end. And I'm gonna right click and duplicate, and I think I'm gonna add a last one in the background right here. So let's just quickly see before this radial filters, and here's after. It's a little bit more interesting, not a huge difference, but I really think that's a good starting base. So now what I'm gonna do is actually zoom in 1 to 2 into the picture, and that is just so I have a lot more detailed view. And I'm gonna grab an adjustment brush and once again add all of this contrast, minus blacks and clarity. And this time, once again, you want to make sure that your feather is at 100 and also that your flow is at 100. And then you just want to go over some structures. So once again, these adjustment brushes are just for the very detailed and kind of minor, smaller adjustments over some, just some detailed part of your picture that you couldn't really do with the radial filters. And you just want to add certain differentiation in a certain very small part. For example, here, by adding a little stroke of plus clarity and all of that stuff, you have some differentiation from the top of this window. And with the adjustment brush, it's always a good idea to, from once in a while, grab a new one and then just adjust your settings and go over another area. And this is really a thing that you can add a ton of. You can really spend a lot of time in that. I'm trying to go relatively compact here for the sake of the video, but the possibilities are really endless. So perhaps just right here, a few more strokes. I'm gonna grab another one and kind of go here, see if that mailbox, so this is definitely way too dark. So here, just want to adjust the sliders. And once again, it's all about differentiation in the whole clarity and the contrast scheme. So you really want to have that not only within your picture, but also within certain areas of your picture, such as cars or buildings or even just very small windows. So I'm gonna do this relatively quick here. Once again, I'm gonna grab another one and just adjust these sliders. And maybe just here, a little bit on this ledge, on these windows, and a little bit in the distance right here. And if I press down O, now this is just the currently selected adjustment brush, but you can see it's very random where I go with these. It's not something that you could do with the radial filters. It's just almost like painting over your picture and kind of seeing where it works and where it doesn't. So I'm just gonna go on here, maybe grab another one with a little bit less and go to this tree. So this tree already has a little bit of differentiation in terms of the contrast and all of that stuff from the radial filters, but now I want to go into the adjustment brush and just fine tune and even adjust all of that even more, maybe some smaller areas. And once again, it's really like painting over your picture. And it kind of takes a little bit of practice, but once you've done it on a few pictures, then you really kind of know what it's all about and where it will work, where it won't. So I'm gonna grab another one here, maybe just over these parts right here, not as much of all of these adjustments, really just a hint. Maybe grab another one right here, just adjust these sliders. And it might get a little bit repetitive for the video here, so that's why I'm trying to make this relatively concise and not spend too much time on it. But I really think it's very important to show you what it actually does in a real world example and show you how small the areas that I actually adjust with these filters are. So I'm just gonna finish up here, maybe gonna spend another minute here with the adjustment brush, but that's about it. So here on the ledges, and you just want differentiation. Once again, it's really amazing what you can do with this kind of technique in your pictures. And let's see down here, maybe just some stones right here, another one there, and even grab another one with just a little bit of effect and go over the road kind of in this area and also make one side of the road look a little bit different than the other. Add a little bit more here on this dark part. And I do think that's pretty much all I'm gonna do here. Maybe just another very, very small one right there. And yeah, I think that does pretty much a job. So let me actually, just another one real quick over here. But let me just show you real quick. So here is before any of these adjustment brushes, and here is after. And it might even seem a little bit overdone at first because you see the direct comparison from before to after, but if you really look at it for a minute or two, you will notice that it looks natural and that it really adds a lot of differentiation. So here's before these adjustment brushes, here's after. Then let's go into the radial filters real quick again. Here's before the radial filters, here's after. So as you can see, it's a very broad adjustment over a very large area compared to all of these small adjustment brushes. And then of course we have this graduated filter that we've added at the start. And with that said, that is already step 2 done. So let's just quickly see where we started at. So this is the raw file, this is it converted into black and white. This is after making the picture very low contrast and very flat. And this is where we are right now. So a lot more differentiation, but at the same time, it still has this low clarity and very interesting and dynamic look. Then the third step is to go back into your local adjustments, so all of this right here. And as you can see, we've just adjusted all of these sliders to make the picture a lot less contrasty at the initial start. but there are still a lot of other sliders, for example the whites, that can really make your picture look so much more interesting and dynamic. And it's very important to also play around with additionally to the, just the kind of core mechanic of making the picture look flat and adding local contrast and clarity. So I brought up the whites a little bit, then I'm gonna go down here to the tonal curve, maybe just bring up the highlights a bit and just play around with the rest of these sliders. So here, maybe a little bit into the minus darks and the shadows, maybe even erase them a little bit. Then if we go down, HSL tool, nothing we have to worry about in black and white, same with the split toning. Then detail tool, this is actually very important, but I'm just gonna leave it out because it doesn't have an effect on the actual look of the picture, but rather the sharpness and the crispness and everything like that. Then down here at the lens corrections, I'm just gonna go into the enable profile corrections, and that will get rid of the distortion as well as the vignetting. And distortion is definitely a nice thing, it corrects everything, but the actual vignetting, I like it, especially in black and white pictures, it can really work, and I like to bring that down. So transform tool, here you could even straighten out some lines even more, but I don't really think it's necessary here. And let's go down to the effects, which is the last global adjustment for this picture. And here you can add even some more additional vignetting. So I'm actually going to do that. And in terms of the amount, I think, just a little bit, maybe -8 or something. And then I'm going to bring down the midpoint more towards the center. And if I show you the extreme example, the midpoint just decides how much of vignetting you have in the picture. And then I'm also gonna bring the feather a little bit to the right to make the edge very soft. And then at the end, of course, go back to my around -9 or maybe -10 amount. So let's see here, yeah, that is really everything that we've done in the global adjustments. That concludes the third step. Let's just quickly see where we started at before all of that. So here is before the step 3, so just after the local contrast and clarity, and here's afterwards. And you see, even though the main focus on this particular editing video is definitely showing you the local contrast and clarity technique, it is still important to also take advantage of all of these other global adjustments. So then let's go into step number 4, and step number 4 is local exposure. So you can also call that dodge and burning, which is pretty much just making individual parts of your picture darker and brighter. And I think I'm mainly going to use the radial filter here. So what I'm going to do here is once again just complexify everything in the picture on a local level, but now instead of with the contrast, blacks and clarity, I'm going to do that with exposure. So actually I'm going to start off with a graduated filter, just bring down the exposure here and kind of drag one over the foreground like this with a very soft edge and just make the foreground a little bit darker. It really works as exposure difference from here into the distance, and I might even do the same thing on the top just to close out the picture, and that actually works pretty good as well. Then let's go into the radial filters. Once again, I really wanted to have the main focus on this local contrast and clarity stuff, so I'm not gonna spend as much time with the exposure here, but dodge and burning is definitely a very important thing regardlessly. And I'm gonna start off here just with a little bit of plus exposure. You can also mix that with a little bit of plus white. And you just kind of want to look over your picture, where is the whole lighting scheme perhaps a little bit boring, where could it use additional interest, for example here on the cars, maybe even on this tree. And once again with these radial filters you can just right click duplicate and then go into the sliders once again and just adjust that very filter. So this might be a little bit choppy, a little bit laggy because it is very hardware intensive, especially with recording the whole process. But if you would like to learn more about dodge and burning in particular, you can also do that by checking out the link in the video description. I've made a completely separate dodge and burning tutorial where I will go a lot more in depth about the whole process. But anyways, let's just add a little bit more here. You know, maybe even on this side, even though this is kind of the dark side, add a little bit more exposure difference here as well. And same with the window. Then maybe down here, just a little bit more in the differentiation, a little bit more complexification. And you always want to look at your lighting scheme, see where the light naturally hits, and just kind of exaggerate that a little bit. So once again, right click duplicate, and I think in about a minute I'm gonna be done with the plus exposure radial filters, and then afterwards I'm gonna go into the minus exposure. So here, for example, just kind of where the light is already hitting, just exaggerating all of that. And maybe here on this tree again, a little bit more into the plus whites. And maybe even on the street right here, kind of make it seem as if the light would have spilled from the sky all the way to the foreground. And you always want to make sure that you don't overdo it, and always want to make sure that you make it look natural. So last few ones over here, it really starts to become a little bit laggy, but I think the recording should be fine. So another one over here, and you know, maybe even go a little bit further into the plus whites. So I think that is pretty much it in terms of the plus exposure radial filters, but now I'm also gonna go a little bit into the minus exposure. And a thing that you might ask yourself is why do that separately and not just add filters with contrast and blacks and clarity as well as exposure? Well, the thing is, if you do that separately, then you have a lot more control over the look of your picture, because you don't necessarily have to add exposure in an area where it perhaps only needs a little bit of clarity or contrast. So you really have the full control that way, and once again, not all areas that need contrast also need minus exposure, so it's really all about control and getting the best possible look at the end. So in terms of the minus exposure, I don't think there's too much to be done here, maybe just a little bit more right there. And yeah, well, maybe another one, a last one right here, and that should pretty much conclude the job, I think. So yeah, another last one over here on the top of this roof, and really make it very small and add quite a lot of minus exposure. And all of that concludes step number 4, which is local exposure. Actually, let me go here into the history and show you. So here is before step number 4, so here we are after all of the steps from 1 to 3, and it is really quite a bit of a difference. So you see, not only contrast is important, but also the whole lighting scheme. It really looks a lot more differentiating and a lot more interesting. So now we're gonna go into the last step, which is step number 5, and that is just kind of fine-tuning everything, going back to the global adjustments, especially the contrast slider that we've added at the start, or rather decreased. And here you just kind of want to see as a last look whether you want maybe a little bit more global contrast, or maybe a little bit less. So, you know, this was just a starting base to bring up the shadows by 100, to bring down the contrast by so much. You can always go back and just kind of fine tune a little bit more. For example, I'm gonna go with the clarity, maybe instead of -20 to around -8. And also with the contrast, I don't want to add too much, but, you know, maybe around -44. And yeah, I think that is pretty much it. Also, another thing that you could do is just go into the local adjustments and also do some fine-tuning there. And I think I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast and blacks over some areas right here with the adjustment brush. So this is really the last kind of minute of fine-tuning everything and making it look as best as it can. And at the same time, I'm going to mix this even with a little bit of minus exposure just for the right side right here, and make this entire area a little bit darker and more contrasty. So then let's actually, you know what, I could even try to kind of fix the exposure in the sky. Now, as you can see with the histogram, there is nothing clipped in the sky, but I think maybe just a little bit of contrast and clarity here could actually work. So let's press down O here to make sure we have it selected at least kind of decently. And then I'm just gonna play around with the exposure and the contrast and everything just for the sky. So let's see here. A little bit of plus contrast might actually work. I definitely think it does. Maybe even minus highlights, a little bit of minus exposure, and even, yeah, a little bit of minus blacks plus clarity. And, well, maybe not that much, you know, just go into the slider, see what works. And then a great thing, you can also just hold down your Alt key and go over an previously adjusted adjustment brush and just go into the minus and get rid of that particular area. So once again, just gonna fine tune that here. And after that, I'm gonna say that I'm done. So let's just quickly go here into the history, and by the way, I'm really happy with this picture. I think it turned out very interesting and very differentiating. And once again, here is the start, here's the picture into black and white, and here's the picture converted into this very low contrast and very flat adjustments and all of that stuff. And that is it after all of these steps, all of these adjustments. And you know, you could just not get this kind of look at the end by just adjusting the global sliders. I mean, there's not just differentiation within the picture itself, but there's also a ton of differentiation both in the contrast as well as the exposure in just certain areas of the picture. So I'm really happy with how the picture turned out, and I think this kind of black and white editing technique is really something that you should at least try out, because it won't work in every single picture. Maybe you don't want to spend all of that time in every single picture, but it is a great tool to have in your arsenal of editing, because it is really sometimes worth to add, and you can make so much more with your black and white pictures. By the way, just a quick note, I found this technique to work particularly in overcast and kind of rainy and cityscape, as well as kind of industrial looking pictures, but you could definitely also do that with landscapes and other stuff. But anyways, that was it for today. I know it's been a little bit lengthy, but I really wanted to show you the whole process from start to finish, and I hope you found it helpful. And if you did enjoy it, then don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one, other Lightroom tutorials, Photoshop videos, and all sorts of photography related videos. Anyways, that was it for today. By the way, if you could either leave me a thumbs up or thumbs down, it would be hugely appreciated. Really helps me to see which kind of videos I should do in the future. And that was pretty much it. So once again, thank you very much for watching, have a great day, and keep on editing great pictures.